There comes a moment in the life of an empath when the silence becomes too loud and the weight they've been quietly carrying suddenly feels like iron chains. You won't see it coming, not because they were weak, but because they were strong for too long. They were the ones who smiled while breaking, the ones who forgave while bleeding, the ones who showed up even when no one ever showed up for them. At first glance, they look gentle, soft-spoken, harmless. But don't mistake their compassion for weakness. That's where most people get it wrong. You see, an empath doesn't become dangerous because they lose their kindness. They become dangerous because they finally realize who they are beneath all the noise. There was a woman I knew, calm, sweet, the kind who could read a room before a single word was spoken. She could feel everything, people's joy, their fear, their manipulation. And because of that, she spent years shrinking herself just to make others comfortable. She tolerated mistreatment, smiled through dismissiveness, and offered understanding to those who'd never earned it, until one day she stopped. No warning, no fight, just a quiet seismic shift. Not because she became cold, but because she finally chose herself. You see, when an empath is fed up, it's not rage that fuels them. It's clarity. And clarity is dangerous because now they stop seeking approval. Now they stop trying to fix what keeps breaking them. Now they stop explaining their worth. They don't burn bridges, they just stop crossing them. And when that shift happens, when the nurturer becomes the boundary setter, when the peacekeeper becomes the truth teller, the world feels their absence. Because they were never just emotional, they were always intuitive, deeply intelligent, fiercely aware. And when they rise in that awareness, they become unstoppable. It usually doesn't happen all at once. It builds silently, invisibly, like pressure in a sealed jar. Day after day, moment after moment, the empath absorbs the sighs that go unheard, the guilt they weren't responsible for, the pain they didn't cause, but were expected to heal, and still they give, again and again, believing that their softness is their strength, and maybe, just maybe, their love will be enough to change what continues to hurt them. But here's the truth no one tells you. Empaths don't snap. They wake up. And when they do, it changes everything. A fed-up empath doesn't become heartless. They become clear. Clear about what they've been tolerating. Clear about who drains their energy and who deserves their light. Clear about the patterns, the subtle manipulation disguised as need, the praise that comes only when they're convenient, the way their silence has been mistaken for agreement. And when that clarity hits, it doesn't come with fireworks or shouting. It comes with a pause, a long, deep breath, and a decision that doesn't need to be announced. There's something hauntingly powerful about someone who has loved deeply and decided to stop performing for love. Empaths, by nature, feel everything. They see behind the masks, sense the tension in rooms others call calm. But that same gift, that deep sensitivity, often becomes the very weapon used against them. You're too emotional. You're overthinking. You're just being dramatic. These are not just words. They're quiet assassins that slowly chip away at a person's sense of self. And so the empath bends, then bends again, until one day they realize they're the only one breaking. Clarity isn't cold, it's clean. It doesn't scream. It whispers truths that were always there. It's the moment she doesn't reply to the apology that's come too late. It's the moment he stops explaining himself to people committed to misunderstanding him. It's the moment they sit with their own thoughts and finally hear their own voice above the noise. There's a reason why people fear the empath who's had enough. It's because that person no longer needs to be liked to feel worthy. They no longer base their decisions on guilt or obligation. They walk away not to hurt you, but to heal themselves. And that quiet kind of power, that scares people. Because it means you can no longer be controlled by their chaos. You begin to see through people, through the empty words, through the recycled apologies, through the fake concern dressed up as care. And most of all, you begin to see yourself again. The version of you before you were trained to put everyone else first. That's the real danger. Not in their revenge, not in their anger, but in their peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you no longer need to fix what's not yours. The kind of peace that comes from realizing you are allowed to choose yourself unapologetically, confidently, finally. Because once an empath becomes clear, they never go back to being blind. Silence is misunderstood. To the outside world, it looks like surrender, like the empath has given up, retreated, accepted defeat. But if you look closer, closer than the average eye is willing to go, you'll see something entirely different. Silence in the life of a fed-up empath is not weakness. It's calibration. It's the moment before the storm shifts direction. It's not the end. It's the beginning of something deeper. Self-reclamation. You see, when someone spends their whole life tuning into everyone else's needs, their own voice becomes an echo. They forget what their truth sounds like. They become fluent in everyone else's emotions and fluent in their own neglect. And so silence becomes necessary, not as a retreat, but as a return. It's in that silence that they start to listen, not to others, but to themselves. For the first time in years, maybe ever, they ask questions they've been too afraid to answer. What do I want? What do I need? What am I doing this for? Who am I without the role I play in everyone else's story? And the answers come slowly, wrapped in discomfort, soaked in clarity, because the truth is, when an empath finally gets quiet, they start to remember all the times they ignored themselves for the sake of keeping someone else comfortable. They remember the times they stayed quiet to keep the peace, smiled when they wanted to scream, said, "I'm fine," when they were anything but. That silence becomes sacred. It becomes a space where no one else's opinion can enter, a space where manipulation, guilt, and expectation cannot survive. In that quiet, they no longer feel the pull to fix broken things that were never theirs to repair. They begin to separate compassion from self-sacrifice. And that's when something powerful begins to unfold. Because once they stop reacting, once they stop justifying, once they stop needing to be understood by people who never care to understand, they become untouchable. It doesn't look loud, it doesn't look rebellious, it looks like stillness. It looks like unbothered eyes and unshaken presence. And it terrifies the ones who once controlled them through guilt and obligation. Because those people fed off of the empath's constant motion. Always explaining, always defending, always proving. But now, there's no need. Now, they realize that not every phone call deserves to be answered. Not every conflict needs to be resolved. Not every relationship needs saving. That kind of realization doesn't scream, it simply decides. You start to see them walking differently. Not faster, not louder, just lighter, like they've set something heavy down. like they're no longer asking for permission to be themselves. That's the quiet revolution. And it doesn't need to be announced. You feel it, you know it when it happens, because silence is no longer about retreat. It's about return. The return to a self that was always there, beneath the noise, waiting to be chosen. There comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when an empath stops seeking validation, not because they stop caring, but because they finally understand. Understand that the approval they've been chasing all their life was never love. It was control. It was currency used by others to keep them small, agreeable, predictable. And the moment that realization sets in, everything changes. You can see it in their eyes. That soft look that used to scan for acceptance is now focused inward. Not angry, not bitter, just awake. For years, they measured their worth by how much others needed them. How often they were praised for their kindness, their selflessness, their ability to be the bigger person. They wore their emotional labor like a badge of honor. Always there, always giving, always the one who could hold space for everyone but themselves. And for a while it felt good being the healer, being the one others turned to, being the one who could absorb the damage and still stand tall. But no one talks about the cost of that identity, the slow erosion of the self, the way their own needs became optional, the way their emotions had to wait in line behind everyone else's. What happens when that person finally stops waiting for a thank you? What happens when the one who always sought to be enough finally realizes they always were, even when no one clapped, even when no one noticed? That's when they stop performing. That's when they stop over-explaining, stop over-giving, stop bending into shapes they were never meant to fit. And what replaces that constant craving for external affirmation is something deeper, something quieter, something unshakable. It's self-trust. And self-trust doesn't beg to be seen. It simply is. Now they no longer ask, do you see me? They ask, do I see myself? And the answer is yes, finally. Yes, without filters, without shame, without shrinking. They began to walk into rooms with a different kind of energy. Not loud, not showy, but solid, like they know something most people don't, because they do. They know what it's like to be invisible in plain sight. They know what it's like to give everything and receive silence in return. And they know the power of deciding that their worth was never up for debate. It's not arrogance, it's alignment. When an empath stops needing validation, they stop being manipulated by those who weaponized approval. The compliments that once kept them tethered now lose their hold. The criticisms that once cut deep now fall flat. Because when your identity no longer depends on what others think of you, you become impossible to control. People notice the shift. They feel it. The energy changes. The person they once leaned on, dumped on, guilted, and praised has become someone they don't quite recognize. Someone they can no longer predict, because now the empath isn't moved by applause. They're moved by peace. They start saying no without explanation. They start choosing silence over arguments that go nowhere. They start choosing their own healing over being the hero in someone else's chaos. That's the quiet danger of a fed-up empath. Not that they become cold, but that they become whole. There's a turning point in every empath's journey, a moment when compassion no longer means self-abandonment. It's subtle at first. They begin to hesitate before saying yes. They pause before offering the 100th second chance. They no longer rush in to fix every fire, because somewhere along the line, they finally realize love without boundaries is not love. It's a slow death. For most of their life, they believed that being kind meant being available, That being good meant being agreeable. That being loving meant being endlessly forgiving, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. They absorbed guilt like it was oxygen, carried other people's emotional weight like it was their duty. And they did it with a smile, with soft eyes, because that's what they were taught, to care more about peace than about truth, more about keeping others safe than keeping themselves whole. But here's what no one tells you. Real peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from being rooted in your own clarity. And once an empath understands this, they don't become hard, they become powerful. Because now their compassion has structure, their kindness has edges, their heart is still wide open, but not for everyone. And that's when power is born. The empath still cares, that will never change. But they no longer carry what was never theirs. They no longer excuse abuse just because they can see the brokenness behind it. They no longer accept pain as the price of connection. They start drawing lines, not as punishment, but as protection. At first it feels unnatural, even selfish, but over time they begin to realize something profound. Boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who's willing to meet you with respect. And for the first time, the empath stops being afraid of losing people. They become more afraid of losing themselves again. This isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming emotionally responsible. They start saying things like, that doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that conversation. I understand how you feel, but I won't abandon myself to accommodate it. Not in anger, not with resentment, just with truth. And truth, when spoken with love and conviction, becomes a force of nature. They're still nurturing, still warm, still capable of deep empathy. But it's no longer on demand. It's no longer up for negotiation. And suddenly the people who once fed off their endless giving are faced with a new version of them. One that no longer bleeds to keep others comfortable, and it's disarming, unsettling. Because it's easy to manipulate someone who doesn't know how to say no. It's easy to guilt someone who ties their worth to being needed. But when the empath rewrites that script, everything changes. That's when they become magnetic. People start respecting them more, listening more. Some walk away, and that's okay. Because now the empath doesn't fear loss. They fear living a life where they betray themselves just to keep the peace. This is the moment when their light becomes focused, no longer scattered, no longer leaking through invisible cracks. Now it's directed. Now it's deliberate. Now it's strong. They don't become someone new. That's the part most people get wrong. A fed-up empath doesn't transform into a different person. They simply return. Return to the version of themselves that existed before the conditioning. Before they were taught that love had to be earned, before they were made to believe their emotions were too much, their intuition too inconvenient, before they were trained to make everyone else comfortable while they quietly disappeared inside their own life. The world shaped them, layer by layer. It taught them to suppress, to adjust, to shrink. They became experts at reading the room, at keeping the peace, at sensing tension before it had a chance to speak. They became so good at showing up for others that they forgot how to show up for themselves. But the truth never disappeared. It just waited. And when an empath finally reaches that breaking point, when the quiet exhaustion turns into sharp awareness, they don't become bitter, they become real. The masks fall off, the old roles lose their grip. The stories they were told that their worth is tied to how much they give, how quiet they stay, how quickly they forgive, start to unravel. And what's left isn't someone colder or harder. What's left is someone honest. That child who once knew how to speak their truth without shame. That version of them who laughed without guilt, who said no without apology, who cried without restraint. That version didn't vanish, it was just buried. beneath expectation, beneath pain, beneath the pressure to be what everyone else needed. Now it rises. And it doesn't rise with rage. It rises with remembrance. They remember who they were before they were taught to be too much, before they learned to fear their own voice, before their boundaries were broken down by those who called their empathy a gift but treated it like an obligation. Now they don't just feel deeply, they act deliberately. They don't just observe, they participate in their own healing. They don't just survive others' storms, they build shelter for themselves first. This return is not loud, it's not for attention, it's for alignment. You start to see it in the way they carry themselves, in the way they speak with precision, in the way they choose presence over performance. They are no longer interested in roles that require them to hide. They are no longer available for dynamics that make them question their worth. They are no longer attracted to people who only value their light when it's dim enough to control. The most dangerous kind of empath is not the one who's angry, it's the one who remembers, because memory brings clarity, and clarity brings power, not power over others, but power within. They remember who they were before they were interrupted, before they were rewritten by heartbreak, before they were told their softness was a flaw, and now they return to that place, not naive, not wounded, but whole. Not as the rescue of others, but as the guardian of themselves. And once they make that return, there is no going back. So here you are, not broken, not defeated, but rebuilt. Stronger, clearer, quieter in all the right ways. The world may never understand the depth you carry, the wars you've fought in silence, the battles you've won without applause, but you know. And that's enough. You felt what it's like to be used for your light, to be loved for your softness but never protected, to be expected to carry everyone's weight while your own needs were ignored. And yet, you're still standing, wiser, sharper, no longer running on approval or bending for belonging. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You are not weak. You are the fire and the calm, the clarity and the storm. And now that you've remembered who you are, the world better take notice. This is your time to stop asking for permission, to stop waiting for someone to validate what you already know. You are powerful beyond measure when you stop abandoning yourself. So walk forward, not softer, not smaller, but with the full force of someone who finally chose themselves. Because a fed-up empath isn't dangerous because they changed. They're dangerous because they came home.